All right, on this episode of Spiritable, we got into the topic of human sexuality, which isn't always easy to discuss, but we think that's kind of part of the problem. So we got into it with Chris Barber here, who has a master's.
Yep, Master of Education in Human Sexuality.
What did we talk about, Richard?
Well, we talked a lot about sort of the connection between sexuality, sex, and spirituality and religion, and are those compatible? Is sex a distraction? Is it a good thing? And we also talked about how to have those conversations and how what the use of those conversations is.
Yeah, I learned a lot. It was insane. So get into it. Check it out. Human Sexuality in the Spiritable Podcast. Hi, I'm Luke.
I'm Richard.
And this is the Spiritable Podcast.
We're having conversations about big spiritual, moral, and social issues in hopefully a more grounded way.
We talk a lot from the religious philosophy of this guy, Emanuel Swedenborg, and our own twist on Christianity. Check out episode 9 for more on that.
But of course, we don't have all the answers, so we like to bring on guests with their own philosophies.
Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, etc.
To help get new perspectives and to challenge each other's beliefs.
Everyone has some relationship with spirituality, but for some dumb reason it can be hard to talk about.
And everyone's experience with life is going to be a little different, and that's what makes it so interesting.
So, thanks for joining us on Spiritable. Here we go. 3, 2. Hey guys.
What up, YouTube? I'm sorry.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Spiritable Podcast. We are here with our dear friend Chris Barber.
I don't know, just every episode you make a deal of how good a friend the person that is the guest
With our
is.
dear, just great friend
With
here, Chris
our
Barber.
significant
Our
lover.
very good pal,
so you
our
can-
special friend, our deep emotional bond, Chris Barber.
Yes. Stop it. Does that mean that you can't have dear friends? Many dear friends?
I guess Ben's saying it had to be exclusive.
They should remove Mr. Rogers
Maybe, like,
from the television.
discerning with your effect.
Welcome back to the Spiritable Podcast. We are here today with Chris Barber, who is coming to lend his insight into our conversation today regarding human sexuality from our new church lens and kind of a spiritual identity. So, welcome, Chris. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me as a guest in your space.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your history with...
To be clear, not your sexual
Not your,
Right, yeah,
not
no.
not your history with sexuality,
No.
but your history in the study of sexuality.
Yeah. I'll just briefly, because I think that the content's more interesting than where I'm coming from. But I completed my Master of Education in Human Sexuality at Widener University in Chester, Pennsylvania. And that's something that I did really to supplement my Master of Divinity, really just in Swedenborgian theology. And I got into the Master of Education in Human Sexuality because I realized that there was a big gap in my knowledge when it came to human sexuality and how the doctrines can feature in conversations on that. But I went there really not to become primarily a sexuality educator or even a sexuality researcher, but to be a sexuality-informed Swedenborgian priest.
So Chris is in the same... Chris has finished the same program that I am currently a part of, that I'll finish next year. So he is...
The divinity program.
Yeah, he is an ordained minister,
Yes.
like I will hopefully be next year.
Hopefully, yes.
You can do exorcisms, you can raise people from the dead, like all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
or-
I haven't been given any of those powers
Cast out
yet.
demons,
Oh, really?
drink poison,
Yeah.
not be harmed.
No
Charm
one...
snakes.
People haven't given me any of the special
Oh,
powers.
that's really disappointing.
And I think it happens when they take you up to the top of a cathedral and then they align 4 bishops. You have to have 4 bishops, living bishops.
like
at the time.
hand by hand kind of.
And lightning, it happens during a storm. It's very Frankenstein-esque. Lightning comes down through the bishops, transfers through their robes, through their hands, and then gets to
Zaps
you.
you.
Yeah. And I got into this subject pretty early on in my ministry, which isn't that old as it is. I realized that there was a big gap in my knowledge when it came to human sexuality. And I was trying to play a lot of catch up and learn a lot of things so that I could speak meaningfully to human sexuality subjects from doctrine.
Well, do you think that comes from a sort of historical fear of talking about these subjects? Like, is that something I experienced, growing up and going to a religious school? It just didn't seem like that was allowed to be part of the conversation because we just don't talk about that, So do you think that's why you felt like there was a gap there? Like that history of fear behind the subject?
That's a good question. I can only speak, I suppose, to my experience personally. I think Personally, I just grew up with a lot of, and I don't know who really gave me this impression of things or this feeling about it, but I grew up with this thought that sexuality is just a dirty thing, that it is a distraction from the stuff that we should be doing. And there is a lot of that in churches. I mean, we can credit Paul with some of that. I believe, with some of his writing we see in the New Testament around sexuality being a distraction from God, and if you give into it, then you're distracting yourself from serving the divine. So make sure you're not giving into it, so that you can be the best disciple of God that you can possibly be.
Right.
And I think that Christian churches, though Christian churches are by no means the only ones who fall into this, but I think Christian churches can fall into this sense that sexuality, not just sex act, but sexuality is not what we're here to be about.
Is a distraction.
It's a distraction.
Is a place of shame or guilt or...
A necessary evil is a language that comes up around sex sometimes in religious conversations.
So did you set out to, with the thought in your mind that this isn't what it is, or were you just curious about it and were like, I wonder why this is such a strange sort of behind closed doors subject?
I don't think I had any sort of agenda other than to become more informed.
Sure. So did that information lead you to affirm what Paul said, and or did you come to different sort of conclusions?
Absolutely not. In fact, it led me even deeper into studying Swedenborg and who he was and what he was about, and what his own understanding about human sexuality was, what his experience with human sexuality was, what his personal regard was for human sexuality. Yeah. And I found some interesting things that kind of distracted me, honestly, I think, because learning about Swedenborg as a person can be useful up to a point, I think.
You don't want to deify.
Right. You don't want to deify him. You don't want to get too distracted in him and his journey, because we each have a journey that we need to be working on.
Right.
Swedenborg is the guy who wrote down the doctrines that really set us apart from other branches of Christianity that make us unique. We believe that he wrote down divine revelation, and
It's pretty rad.
It's pretty rad. And a lot of his doctrines are actually contrary to the writings of people like Paul. Actually talk highly of sexuality as an expression of a deep connective love, a married love.
Yeah, it's a good little explanation. I also want any listeners or watchers right now know that we're going into this trying to find new levels of enlightenment, and I'm glad that I hope it feels awkward for some people, and that they stick with us and push through it, because it's the same like you were saying when you were younger. I felt awkward about sexuality or anything to do with myself as a sexual being when I was younger and developing into a pubescent young lad.
Yeah.
I had a lot of shame and guilt around that. So
Interestingly enough, I never feel like I felt any of that. So I think it's hard to balance marriage being really important, which our church stresses, with sort of the nature of especially adolescent sexuality. Like we talk about this ideal connection of marriage, and then even right now I'm still like, well, that's great, but I'm here. And is it okay that I'm here? Is it shameful that I'm here? Is it wrong that I'm here? Is this a step that's okay? Should I be comfortable where I am? All these questions. And I feel like I've had those questions, but I also never felt like I felt a strong amount of guilt or shame around my sexuality. And a lot
definitely
of people
didn't. I don't know where that comes. I even had pretty open conversations with my parents about sexuality, and what was normal and it's okay. Don't feel shame. I was explicitly told that, and yet.
Hey, I wonder. It's interesting. The don't feel shame. I wonder if that in itself, feeling like that has to be a conversation, can lead to the sense that wait, but I should be. Why would we be having this conversation if it wasn't shameful? And I don't know. I don't know how you really avoid that, because some families can be super open with conversations around it, and others can be really closed, and the kids who grow up in those environments might push back against their parents' openness about it. And a lot of it has to do with peer groups, and our educational systems and a lot of public schools especially don't do a great job with sexuality education. They can do sex ed. They can tell you the biology of it. They can tell you how things work. But as soon as it approaches anything speaking of pleasure, anything speaking of the self-worth that comes along with that, that seems like it's crossing a line.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because of communities that don't want the education systems having those conversations. They
like
believe
more
that
conservative communities that don't want to promote, I don't know, like free love or anything like
yeah,
that.
I wouldn't. I mean, I think it's easy to put it on conservative communities, but I wouldn't say that it's exclusive to more conservative communities, because you can have involved liberal parents feeling like, no, those are conversations that I think belong between me and my child.
Right.
And so, on the one hand, it could be ideological. On the other, it could be just because of the way the parents feel like they ought to be bringing up their kids.
Right.
And they want to be the ones guiding those meaningful conversations. And so, I don't know, there is a lot of shame that exists, which is really weird.
Well, yeah, I mean, I want to get into the nitty gritty of it a little bit, because that's, I feel like, the most useful. And I think my, at least, perception and experience of other Christian religions besides the New Church, and some even in the New Church, that view of sex acts or sexuality can only be expressed in a marriage in almost a like scientific way of sex is for reproduction. That is it. It's like one track, one note, one and done. Have kids. And that's
it's called missionary position for a reason. I mean, not to become overly explicit, but there is actually a reason for that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
How else do you grow the church?
More babies. But I do think a lot of people have that sort of mindset. And so from my study of the writings, and there's this one book, Conjugal Love by Emanuel Swedenborg, that talks a lot about married love and what the expression of that and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And, for a long time I was kind of searching for answers and trying to figure out, what is right and wrong and ways to behave romantically, sexually with a partner before marriage, because I'm not married and I've been in relationships, and to me it kind of seems like there's a gray area between being married and starting in a relationship and how romantic things should be. And the way I always kind of interpreted it was that the more you progress and get to know each other and get closer mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the closer you should be romantically. So there's a balance between the physical and the spiritual in a relationship. So am I a heretic? What do you think?
You're not a heretic. And I, as a priest, don't want to undervalue the work that you are doing to understand this stuff as a layperson. Ideally, lay people are going to be able to study this and find what they need without having a priest on hand. Right. I mean, the Lord's trying to speak with everybody, not just through priests. Yeah. So I like what I hear you describing. You're approaching it. You're looking for answers from it yourself. You're not a heretic. You might be for other reasons.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
But in this area, I really don't think you are. And it's weird. You talked about, what was it, intimacy and romance?
Kind of like emotional, mental, spiritual closeness and physical closeness. Like balancing the physical and the spiritual.
It's kind of crazy, but it's almost like you're revving your physical engines. I don't know if that works. I'm not a car person. But you're kind of revving your... You can rev... Okay, I'm going to rev my physical engine here. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm in park still, or neutral or whatever. I really don't know cars.
But you keep going with the analogy.
I'm just going to keep going. Hope I don't stall. And
nice.
Yes, I tried. While somehow you have your intimate, emotional, spiritual life growing up until a certain point, and then it's almost like you you reach up to this level.
What kind of
After a
model are
time.
you talking? Are you talking
So
about like nothing until marriage? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
The doctrines, the church is, like I mentioned, it's sex positive. It's a sex positive theology, and I think sometimes it gets presented as being an abstinence only theology.
Well, and I don't think our church is the only one that falls into that trap.
Right. But we are very specifically in our doctrines not an abstinence only theology. It's like right in the passages. It'll tell you about people who are having sex before marriage or outside of marriage, how it's not ideal because of that internal connection that the Lord is hoping will build first. Because physical is a distraction, right? Physical can be a distraction from doing real internal work. And that's why there is this kind of delay that it recommends.
But physical also, and I think the thing that really intrigues me is that it's not like physical can be a distraction, so we need to not engage in physical. And
right.
There's this idea of the physical thing, the foundational thing, the physical thing being a foundation for what's deeper. You know, like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, you really love your friend, you have a close friend, and so you get them a gift to show that you really care about them. Yeah, you don't care about them anymore by giving them a gift. It doesn't mean that you care about them more than if you hadn't given them a gift, but it's something concrete that is a memory formed about your love for them. And physicality is in New Church ideas is the same way, that it's not like, oh, well, I guess you can do that if you have to. It's like, this is actually what's going to hold and remind you and be a symbol for the internal connection that you have with each other.
Yeah. But
which is so cool.
But the idea of how a gift as a pledge for like your engagement. For example, let's just talk about an engagement ring or something. Mm-hmm. It's just a physical thing, really meaningful. When people get engaged, they get so excited about the ring. Hopefully, yeah. I was excited about mine. You'll know I'm wearing 2 rings.
You're blinged out, man.
I'm very blinked. But I'll talk about my wedding stuff. I got an engagement and I have a wedding ring. And what I like about how the New Church sort of thinks about engagement rings is this idea that it's a physical reminder of your deep internal connection. And sex and sex specifically, sex acts, are talked about in the church as being the place, like the physical resting place for the spiritual internal connection between specifically the married partners. But also it is there for people who are looking to that long-term, hopefully eternal connection.
Yeah. But
that does open up the fact that there is a difference according to the doctrines that I'm trained in and believe in, that there is a difference in quality between the sex that's had between people who are just hooking up and the sex that's had between people who are committed long term. But you were saying that as well.
And I also think you have to be careful with looking at sex as the resting place, the foundation or whatever for that kind of thing. Because I think it's dangerous to have sexual expression be looked at as the solution for problems in a relationship, or what people fall back on when the relationship is in hard times.
Yeah,
I think it seems like it should be more the expression of when good things are happening.
Yeah, and at the same time, there can be a healing element to, or at the very least, a kind of, I don't know if it's negotiating or whatever, I don't know. There is something to physical sex that brings people together and can take away from some of those internal frustrations or differences or difficulties. I mean, we can just sort of talk about the concept of makeup sex. There's a reason that's a concept. It can, because there is a physical connection there that's delightful, that's very pleasing, it can kind of take away from some of the sting of arguments that have happened or of frustration that was just there.
Look past the little things.
I don't want to like discount it as, and push it away from being used as a kind of healing tool in a relationship, because it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
but,
also an element.
But I guess there's a difference between a healing tool and sort of a cover to hide a problem.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, we're arguing and we haven't really resolved it, but let's just have sex, and then we'll both feel connected after that, and we won't have to deal with this.
Yeah, if sex is the only good thing about your relationship,
Right.
that's not going to last.
And I guess that's not what I was thinking of.
No,
in that
no,
term.
I'm not.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
so
that's where it's
there's an
at.
interesting nuance there between like when things have resolved, and sometimes things resolve, but people aren't like happy with it yet. Like we've made it, we've come to an agreement that works for both of us, but we're still kind of grumpy about the exchange we just had.
Unhappy that it happened in the first place.
Yeah,
Kind of residual.
Even though it's over, there's like residual stuff, and I think that's a great time for a physical connection to sort of reestablish the fact that, oh yeah, we really care about each other.
Yeah.
And it's not like you said, sort of like, oh, let's use it to fix things because we're in trouble. But like, okay, yeah, we've dealt with that. Now let's put it behind us. Kind of thing.
Yeah. So Chris, getting back to kind of your training and expertise, how does what you learned from your master's program in human sexuality affect your religious instruction?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the courses that I teach is a course specifically on marriage, and it seems ridiculous to teach marriage to high schoolers. It's not really what they're thinking about. But the way that I often frame it is the rules for healthy marriage are the same as the rules for healthy friendship. And they've all got friendships. And so studying human sexuality has given me a different sense of sexuality as a thing. Because I think beforehand I was just thinking about sex as an act.
Not like the full range of
Not the full
expression.
range of not even expression, but experience and identity and all of that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about there is a curriculum. It's called Our Whole Lives. I don't know if you've heard of it. And it was put out by a religious organization, actually, but it's used by a lot of secular groups. I think it was the Unitarians who put it out. Really an amazing program that believes that starting from as early as you can, helping people to realize that they are sexual beings, and that's amazing. Like, they are sexual beings, and that's what they were created to be. Whether it was by their creator above, or whether it was by just the natural world that formed them, that's what they're made to be. And it approaches
That's so
things
cool.
like, it's amazing. And I think it's...
Because I just don't think that's something that's a big dialogue or talked about. You know, I never saw myself as an amazing being because of my sexuality.
Yeah.
You know?
But it factors into so much of what we do and who we are. I think it's actually available online, maybe for free, or for just a little bit of money. You can check it out, just anyone. I think there are a lot of great things in there, especially if you go to it and look at the introductory material for each grade, and you get a sense for the conversations they're hoping people will have. I think there are a lot of adults who haven't had the conversations that this group is trying to get kids to start having.
So what do you do with that information?
Well, for me, it has reformed how I think about how the Lord presents this concept of sexuality. I think that before I thought there was marriage and there was sex, and they're connected, but they're not so intertwined that there is human existence and there is sex, that there are academics and there is sex, and that it was always this, like, there's
Removed,
history
sort of.
and there is sex, there's biology, and then there's sexual reproduction, which we'll leave to our health teachers. I never really thought about it as being integrated in all of the subjects, or at least as in an ideal world, being integrated into all those. Sexuality is a part of people's lives, and if you deny them that, then you are cutting off a huge part of them. And I think part of the problem is that a lot of people have normalized that. They've normalized
the absence of
absence of sexuality. And that you're not serving the whole person. if you cut that out of conversations.
Yeah.
So this idea of human sexuality and sort of the community experience of it, I think affects personal experience just no matter what. And I saw that growing up even between myself and my school friends. So I went to a private religious school, and all my friends lived in basically a different community. They lived near the school, and so they were all sort of one community, and I commuted to school from like 20 minutes away. And so I experienced a very different experience with sexuality growing up there. I mean, when I was 13, I had this friend that I made, and she was fine, and she was a good friend of mine.
Was she fine or was she fine?
Well, she was 14 at the time, so
Hey.
she was a child. But at the time, I thought she was fine. But anyway, turns out she was a prostitute. So that was a weird thing for 13-year-old Richard to know that 14-year-old girls were doing in my area. So yeah, just it seemed like a different experience than other people in more isolated religious communities have. And I guess in my family life, I never felt like we had long, drawn-out conversations about sex and how it worked and what was expected of me. But I always sort of felt like I knew where I stood. Like
Where you stood with them? Where you stood on your own beliefs? And
with them and their expectations of what they wanted for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not really sure how my parents managed that. But like we would be sitting and we'd be watching a show, and it'd be a show that the family would watch together, and there would be a scene where like two people like had sex and stuff, and not like an extremely graphic scene or anything, but primetime television kind of sex scene. And my parents would just turn to me and be like, "Don't have sex, don't do drugs." And I'd be like, "Yeah, Mom." And then like that was mostly the extent of like my sex ed conversations with my parents.
Interesting how they slip drugs in there too.
Well, that was just always sort of the mantra. They would slip the sex line into like a scene with a lot of drug use in it too.
Okay.
They're a package. I don't know, like the two things the parents are worried their kids are going to get involved in. You know? Sex,
Never
drugs,
embezzlement.
But my parents liked rock and roll, so I think that is why for me I never really had much of a like
stigma
around sex, because I was like, I don't know what's happening around me. And that's not what I want for myself, because I like what my parents have to say, and I like the community that I went to school with better than the community around my neighborhood. So I always sort of saw like I have a choice, and I just like that one better.
Okay.
So it always sort of felt like it wasn't put on me, like I had chosen it, which I think was a really healthy thing for me. And I think I avoided a lot of, and I talked to a lot of people that grow up in religious communities that talk about like, even after I got married, it was hard to adjust to having sex with my wife because it still felt like, oh no, sex bad. Sex is the icky thing that you don't do. And I mean, I'm not married, so I don't know what that's going to be like for me. But I wonder how a community that wants to hold up the ideal of sort of a balanced, like you were talking about, a balanced physical connection, how they hold up that ideal without making people feel like where they are is bad or wrong, or like because there is a good use of it, the bad use of it makes you a horrible person, so much so that even when you're doing things right, according to the community, you still have this sort of residual like, I don't know about it.
I think that connects with something that we've talked about around there's an ideal, this sort of ideal image of sex and how it works and when it happens, and where kids are when they start thinking about it, learning about it, encountering it in popular culture, in their media, from their peers, whatever. And the difference between the ideal and where we are, or where they are, can be filled in with shame, or it can be filled in with other negative feelings about themselves or about others, which are actually just them projecting their negative feelings that have been put on them. I really do believe in a more comprehensive sexuality education, something that's willing to go into the biology, something that's willing to go into the pleasure of it, something that's willing to go into the media conversations and the self-worth stuff, all of that. I think that there is a sense, and it's a misguided sense, but there is a sense that if you teach it, then they'll engage in it. If you teach about contraceptives, then they're all
They'll
going to
know what to do.
Yeah,
so
they'll know exactly what to do.
Yeah.
Yes, they'll know exactly what to do. Do you want to leave them in ignorance? At the end of the day, people are going to make the choices that they're going to make. And that's something that I keep in mind quite a bit because, I mean, teaching high school, kids just do what they do. They just do what they do. And they don't know why they're doing all the things that they're doing. And sometimes they make mistakes. And if they have a sense that their peers or the people who are the adults who are in their lives are super negative on something that maybe they did and they weren't thinking about it, or they thought it was a good idea at the time, and they've come to realize, no, that wasn't good. If they feel like everyone is negative about it around them, then they just absorb that and maybe don't have the way to reconcile all those different things within them, and they're left very much isolated. But of course, the sad truth is that everyone in their community is probably also feeling a degree of isolation around it.
Yeah.
So what I like about a more comprehensive sexuality education, one that includes spirituality, one that includes doctrine, what I like about the one that I mentioned, the Our Whole Lives OWL curriculum, is that it can be modified by anyone who's using it to incorporate the values of your community. I think you're right. Community is so important, and we pick up so much from our communities that's healthy and that's unhealthy. Sexuality is one of the places where we pick them up, but we then don't talk about them. And so maybe we can go out and address some other things with peers and friends and with people who we learn from outside of our communities, but we carry the sexuality stuff with us because we pick up this sense that we don't talk about that.
And I think especially when institutionally it's not talked about, that idea gets reinforced.
Yes.
That we don't talk about it then.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, because when we pick up other stuff from our community, talking about it is what lets us choose whether we want to put it down or not.
Yeah.
But when we don't talk about it, when we just are like, this is what I have, this is the way that it is, and I'm not allowed to talk about it, there's no way to really put it down. Whether it's healthy or unhealthy, there's no way to make a choice with it.
Yeah. I think that churches can play a big role in having positive conversations around this, making space for that, by acknowledging that the Bible is also a deeply sexual book.
Yeah. Sometimes darkly so.
Yeah, some of it
presents
darkly
all
so.
sides of it.
Yeah, and you do get that spectrum in there.
Yeah.
And you look at something that, like Song of Solomon, which is a deeply sexual book. We look at, it's so crazy. I spent some time with this last year. It's on my mind a lot, and eventually I'll do some real research on it. But the sexual nature of the relationship between the Lord and His church. So we think in Scripture, the image of the church as a bride. And the Lord as
some deep Swedenborgianism right here.
It doesn't even have to be deep Swedenborgianism. I haven't even mentioned anything very specifically Swedenborgian about the Scripture stuff. This is just Old Testament, New Testament.
Okay.
Without any Swedenborg on there at all. You look in there and you find in the Old Testament prophecies. I think Hosea has some. I think Isaiah also has some in the Old Testament.
Saying what exactly?
Which is saying that the relationship between God and Jerusalem, or God and Israel, God and His church, is one that is a marriage and it is sexual. I mean, that's why idolatry, having other gods before whom you bow down, is also talked about as an adultery.
Yeah, Hosea has stuff that talks about an adulterous spouse and
Yeah.
like you would leave a spouse that is committing adultery against you, and yet I'm willing to take you back.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of this interesting.
Even though you've been whoring yourself out with all of the other nations, and that's pretty much, the language actually is really harsh in Hosea about it. But if we look at it, if we look at the negative, so it's really harsh because Jerusalem is doing all sorts of stuff it shouldn't do, kind of idolatrous, and it's talked about as an adultery. If an unhealthy relationship between the Lord and his church is one where the church is adulterous, sleeping around, very, very specifically, I'm not reading into this.
Right.
Very specific or explicitly sleeping around, then what is a positive relationship between the Lord and his church? It is a monogamous, sexually active relationship between the Lord and his church.
That trips me out a little bit.
I'm sorry, right? And if it only showed up in Hosea, or if it only showed up in Isaiah, and if it was something where you were only reading between the lines, and that's how I got there, then that would be one thing. Mm-hmm. But this is so explicitly stated. So if God is sex positive, what business do we have being sex negative?
I like that tagline. I mean, that's super true. Yeah, I don't know.
And even to make it talk a little bit more like in terms of Swedenborg and the new church, Swedenborg writes about sexuality. He writes about it in his later works. He writes about it in his earlier works, in his pre-theological stuff. When he was just doing anatomy, he has a book all about the organs of generation, reproductive organs, where he speaks pretty candidly, not about his own experience, but you wonder where he's getting the words that he's using. Yeah. He talks about the experience of human sexual expression.
Sexual pleasure.
Sexual pleasure. He talks about the delicious violence with which it's a weird language, right? But it's old language, violence being the energy behind it. But he uses the word delicious, or at least that's how it gets translated. The delicious violence with which the sexual energy takes over a person when they are engaged in the act. Yeah. He talks about it in a positive and delightful and energetic way. If we talk about it more openly, and that's why I'm glad to be able to be here and talking to you and talking to you. I haven't forgotten you. It's kind of an opportunity to say,
to have that platform.
There is a sex positive religious perspective that you can hold that isn't heretical, that isn't blasphemous, that isn't purely secular, but it seems exactly what God wants for us.
I don't know. I feel like often there's a sort of dialogue of either there's we don't talk about it, we don't think about it, it happens in marriage, it's very strictly that side, or free love, like, oh, just go have sex with everything, sexual acts should be explored willy-nilly. So where do we find that balance? How do we talk about it? How do we properly engage with it from a religious context?
I think we do it like this, like we're doing now, with humor and finding ways to kind of park your shames or park your judgments or whatever, even just for the duration of the conversation, and probably most importantly, doing it deliberately. Yeah. Because if you're just going to wait for it to happen, it's probably not going to happen. And it's probably not going to happen because a lot of people get trained into not letting it happen, trained into avoiding the conversations, trained into blushing over it and treating that as a sign that they've entered into bad territory.
Right?
When maybe it's just risky territory. And just because it's risky doesn't mean that it's bad. I was nervous about this conversation.
Just because it's not traditionally talked about doesn't mean you can't talk about it. You know?
Yeah, and I was nervous about this conversation a little bit because of the permanence of it. Yeah. There's a microphone there.
There's the internet.
And it's recording the thing, and there's the camera. And, I think that to take these conversations and to put them in concrete is not great because they're ongoing dialogues. Oftentimes,
and it's stuck in time. It's not flexible. It is what it is.
And I think that and then you want to say something. And I think that it's important that they're ongoing dialogues with yourself. Because you, more than anybody else, are the person with whom you have to reconcile these thoughts. Those definitely some of the things I think about it.
Yeah, and they're ongoing in time and also ongoing in circumstance. The way that we talk about it here today is not going to be the same conclusions or even the same premises that I use when talking about it with whoever else next week or whoever else 10 years from now. Like
grandkid's gonna look back at this and be like, Grandpa, what are you talking about?
Yeah, right.
So I think keeping in mind that one thing that I have been thinking about recently is how little we know about human sexuality, even though it's been around since the beginning of humanity. How did that happen? What?
Yeah. Predates humanity. It's just sexuality itself.
It's the origin of life, quite literally.
Yeah.
And yet we're like, I don't know, I don't want to talk about that. It seems like a big can of worms to open. I don't know. It's like it's so foundational, both to the continuation of the human race or any race for that matter, any life for that matter.
Well, and there are asexually reproducing species.
Fair enough.
Which are fascinating to consider in a theological context. I won't go there.
Yeah, it's a whole different concept.
Very different. But yeah, it's been around for so long. And yet it's one of these things that only really got studied formally starting in the 19th century. Sexuality, even just as a term, wasn't a thing before 1850s or so. It's kind of crazy to think of that. That doesn't mean that the reproductive organs hadn't been studied. They were well understood by the time Swedenborg came around. A lot of stuff figured out about them. Swedenborg wrote extensively on them, but sexuality as a concept, the experience of the organic, that is so important. It's just not something that we are good at talking about, even though we are the result of it. It's just we owe so much to it. I love the point you're making about that, because it feels like an embarrassment. Like if we were ashamed about anything, it should be
as
that it's
humanity.
as humanity that we put this most important thing in a box and said, we rely on you, but we'll bring you out only once in a while, only when you make enough noise that we have to. And
I love that point about it basically being 300 years old max, the study of sexuality.
Formally.
The formal study of sexuality.
Formal study, younger than that even, but
that's how long have we been studying philosophy? How long have we been studying war?
Right.
How long have we been studying politics?
And this is an area where we have intimate, everyday experience with it and interaction with it, and can't go there. Yeah. You can go there. You do go there.
So how do we encourage this kind of conversation among other people who feel uncomfortable by it? Because I feel like we're pretty open to talk about most things, and we're doing this. So obviously,
and I haven't always been comfortable with it as a topic.
Yeah, neither have I, and we've all had our paths getting there. But how do we encourage this kind of conversation with other people?
Because what do you think?
Can you?
I think
I'm just imagining approaching
just
my grandpa and having this conversation. No, it's not going to happen.
Why not? Not specifically him, but what are some of those dynamics that feed into
Let's unpack it. I think it's...
Are you talking Grandpa Pete right now?
I'm not going to call out my individual grandfather on here.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I think it's just an uncomfortability. It's never happened before. It's never been a mode of conversation, at least in my familial history. It would just be deeply uncomfortable for me, and I can't put a good reason on that necessarily, other than it just doesn't happen, and it feels like there would be sort of consequences behind it of how people view each other, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think if you were to make a list of most uncomfortable things talking about sex with your grandparents would be high on that list.
Yeah.
It's
but
not
is there
true
a
for
good
everybody,
reason?
though.
But
Yeah, it's
is
not
there a
true
good
for
reason
everyone.
behind that?
So it's not a given. Yeah, when I think about it, I do think it is because it's so personal. And not everyone has, and I do think that there needs to be space here for this, is that not everyone actually has sexual experience or desire or wish to engage in that, or not everyone thinks of themselves as being
Right.
a sexual being, and I think that those conversations are more nuanced and need people who I think identify with that experience to be present to discuss that. But it's a real thing, whether people are experiencing it for themselves or seeing it out there, or
Yeah.
people they care about, or
Well-
like sexuality is such a part of human society, and yet we just try not to talk about it.
I think some of it comes down to it's one of the most vulnerable human experiences.
That's what I was gonna
Is
say.
to be, well, one, sexually open and available with another individual and engage in those kinds of things, and another just to talk about it from an interest standpoint, a pleasure standpoint,
Yeah.
a scientific standpoint, even like that amount of vulnerability. I think is deeper than a lot of other subjects. And so maybe that's a reason why the idea of having that conversation with my grandfather, or even with other members of my family, of like, I'm incredibly close with members of my family, but talking about their sexual pleasure, that's real uncomfortable.
We're able to talk about foods we like to eat.
Right.
The
pleasure of a nectarine.
Right. The pleasure of a nectarine, if you will. We're able to talk about
Nectarines are so good.
Yeah.
the juices of a burger and how those sort of just feel out. We just love the sensation of it moving through. That's so delightful.
Yeah,
We're
but
able to like.
I'm not going to ask sexually explicit questions.
Yeah.
To my dad.
And it's weird though. Like, eating is personal. We can talk about how we
Eating's
love the
not
feel of a
vulnerable,
fabric. You're right. There isn't vulnerability in
There's
that.
a vulnerability behind sexuality.
Yeah.
And why is that? Is that because it is a deeply spiritual thing? Because it's so connective to other people?
Yeah, I think it naturally is a vulnerable thing to connect with someone, because first of all, I think to compare it with other sensations might be a bit misleading, because I think it is a sensation much different than any other sense of touch.
People talk about going to a masseuse, and they love getting a massage, and they talk about that. There's vulnerability in that. That's deeply sensual.
Physical.
But I think even still, the sexual pleasure I think is, and I can't really put my finger on why, but it's so different.
Yeah.
And it has a sense of vulnerability. And I think a lot of the importance of it as an act is that it is saying, like, I am willing to be the most vulnerable with you.
And it's special.
It's almost like at least I see it as almost like the ultimate vulnerability. The act of sex is almost like the ultimate vulnerability.
If it's the ultimate vulnerability, then how do we have it so free and easy for so many people? Just thinking of you mentioned before, some of the app-based connections people are able to make. Craigslist, which is now, I guess, shut down, but that was a big place.
Craigslist is shut down?
Not Craigslist.
Like the
personal ads have been shut down.
Interesting.
But that was an area where there was a lot of
There goes my weekend plan.
free, a lot of free and easy connections.
Yeah.
So if it is where we're most vulnerable, are they thrill seekers? Are they going out of their way to make themselves unsafe? Or because I don't.
Well, I think
So I don't think that the vulnerability
maybe just 'cause,
thing-
you can desensitize yourself to other things. You can desensitize yourself to the vulnerability and emotionality, spirituality of sex or sexual acts.
I think that's true.
Yeah, so maybe it
But I
was originally designed, or it is innately a vulnerable thing, but culture and experience can weed that vulnerability out of it, or find real power in that vulnerability.
I'd say that culture has woven the vulnerability into it. I mean, if we think about animal sexuality and you know, in the animal kingdom, mating rituals, courtship rituals, and then the copulation that takes place, it's not, you don't see them approaching it as a.
But also, like, humans are different than animals.
But human sexuality has its origin in animal sexuality.
Yeah, but I think
and so again, I don't think
as much
that
as we're spiritual beings, though, and I think there's some of that with sexuality, and I think vulnerability doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just letting someone into the deepest parts of yourself.
Well, as soon as we're talking about inherency, I bristle, I push back a bit.
Yeah, I understand that, and it's kind of a tough situation to talk about. Was vulnerability woven into sexuality, or was it innate in sexuality, and then people sort of thread it out? And maybe that's not even a productive conversation.
I was just thinking, like, what are we doing here?
However, wherever that comes from, I think that for a lot of people, it's a very intimate thing. And I think for myself, I see sexuality as a very intimate thing. In the same way that I don't want to talk about my deepest insecurities with someone that I don't trust.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about the specifics of my sexuality with someone that I don't trust.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be having those conversations, but I do agree with Luke that there's a balance to be had, that it's not like everyone open, talk about it, the opener the better. Because there's the ability to get hurt in that as well.
Yeah, but would you you talked about
at the same time.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. But I think that, you talk about the vulnerability, you talk about the most intimate details of your life, you're only going to offer that with someone you trust. Are you talking about your finances with people who you don't trust? Are you talking about, like, just what is the marker here for what sets sexuality apart? I don't know if it's the vulnerability. I don't want to stay on it for too long.
Yeah, but I think
because I don't know if
but
it
is a fun point of, like, not contention, but we're trying to figure something out, which is fun.
Go on.
And I think with sexuality, I'm saying vulnerability. I think the level of exposure there, from a physical standpoint, and from an emotional standpoint, I think that's something more than normal, more than you're going to find about even your deepest insecurities or your financial situation.
Yeah, no, I think biblically, like, it's kind of funny. Shame. They were ashamed. So Adam and Eve, early Genesis, Adam and Eve are ashamed. So they make clothes for themselves. But it's not their nakedness that actually makes them ashamed. It's their activity. It's the fact that they did things that they should not have done, that they were wronged, and that's what introduced shame into their lives. I think there is some degree of parallel in that, where the protection of that sexuality, or the hiding of it, or the withholding, that's not a good word, but the sort of keeping it away, is a later thing. If we're talking scripturally, and how can we really roll back the clock and see the first societies, how they engaged in it? But if it is the case that we're coming out of, that human sexuality in the timeline is secondary to animal sexuality, if we're coming out of that, and the new church is comfortable with evolution, it is comfortable with that long-term development of the human species, I think that the kind of thing that we're talking about here is injected by humanity, by society, and maybe as a move away from some of the more ideal forms that maybe the Lord would have for us. Not saying that he would have us be super free and open with our sexual expression and sexuality, but he would have us be comfortable with ourselves as sexual beings.
And at least comfortable in the dialogue of it.
And I think it this uncomfortability, I think you see come out, and I'm about to do some armchair psychology here, so take it with a grain of salt. But from my personal experience, so much of people's like really harmful baggage that they carry with them has a sexual origin. And whether that's explicitly like sexual abuse, or whether that's like, I've always thought I was like hideous and how could anyone find me attractive? I feel like the shame that people carry with them, the guilt, the baggage that they have, the stuff they have to work through so often relates to their sexuality. And so is that because it is a really vulnerable thing? Or is that because we have applied an idea of shame to it? And maybe it doesn't have to be an either or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, without commenting on your armchair psychology, but the point you were making, I think there's something in what you're saying. I can't quite parse it out for myself this minute.
Yeah, it's tough to.
But I think that there's something in there. I like it. I like what I think you're doing. And I think that it kind of got captured in the vulnerability as one part of the conversation, but there also seems to be a kind of preciousness in there, kind of a pearl, if you will.
In a good way or a bad way?
In a good way.
Yeah.
In a good way. And so there is a protection over that.
Yeah, some of that, the special nature is something that I wanted to touch on as well. I think we're all kind of in this. I think we're all getting to a point where sexuality and the discussion of it, doing away with the stigma, the weird history of putting it in a box and shutting it away and not talking about it is not useful. But sexuality is still a very vulnerable and special thing expressed between two people who love each other and want to have that, and it is contained best in that relationship.
Okay, yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we can't talk about it and from a biological standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, from a pleasure standpoint. I think there are things we can talk about there. I
think finding those places where, I mean, even just down to like, I'm trying not to get too explicit with things, which maybe is part of the problem. Who knows? But even just down to like a specific person's preferences, the exploration of that intellectually, even just talking about like this happened to me and I don't know how I feel about it. I don't know if I was okay with that. I don't know if I want to explore, like, where is the place for people to talk about that?
Yeah.
Because a lot of people find it especially hard to talk about that with their significant other, with the person they're close to, because it's something that is close to them, and they're so worried. What if they say, "Ew"? What if they say, "How dare you?" Like, what? Why would you possibly want that?
And your relationship should be the safest place.
And so we don't even just to understand the specifics of your own sexuality, there's not really a place to talk about it.
You've painted a real picture here of some of the challenge, right? You're talking on the one hand about the person with whom you feel the safest or the closest or people you trust, and then it feels sometimes like the stakes are even higher there. Mm-hmm. So the place where you should be able to have those conversations, it seems like maybe you can't. And again, you're back to being this isolated. Yeah. And gracious, this is a good conversation.
Yeah.
I don't think we've answered anything.
I just think the big takeaway seems to be that the solution is not a lack of conversation.
Yeah.
The solution is not keeping it in that box hidden away.
Well done.
And I like getting back to what you said a while ago about deliberacy. Is that a word?
I don't know. It is now. I like it.
Deliberacy.
Deliberacy.
Add to the dictionary, kiddos.
Yes. Can you put it across the bottom of the screen?
Deliberacy.
Yes.
Sorry, I stole your...
Yeah, well, that's right. We did
I was
it together.
Gonna do it, but you beat me to
It's
it.
more work for me.
Let's all frame it. I'll do this end.
Deliberacy.
All right. So this idea of being deliberate about your discussion with it, because I think I still support the fact that if you treat it in a sort of a nonchalant way, then there's room for pain there.
Yes.
Because if you come across in a nonchalant way something that really is really meaningful to you, and people don't treat that with respect, that's where pain happens in communication.
Yeah.
So that deliberateness, that deliberacy, of like coming to a conversation with that as the goal and saying let's really talk about this. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, okay, let's talk about this. It can be an exciting thing. It could be a jovial thing. It can be whatever it needs to be. But you should try to make it that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because if you just are like, oh, hopefully they'll be okay with it without like introducing them to what you're doing, to a thing that's new to culture, is openly talking about this is very new.
At least in cultures we're experiencing.
I mean, I'm in American culture,
right?
And from my knowledge, from my picture of like the 50s, that's like my classic like.
That's where you go.
People don't talk about it. It's like the 50s.
Well, I mean, they couldn't even show married couples in the same bed. Back in that Dick Van Dyke show.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this huge stigma, and we're not that far away from that.
That's true. In the grand scheme of
things. There is a weird sort of post-Victorian collective trauma that that I think we fight against, that we push against. Globally, there are places that are more open to these kinds of conversations. But yeah, definitely in my experience of life, American life, it's definitely been a repressed kind of thing.
Yeah. So what's the message? I feel like we're saying so many good things, and what's the takeaway?
Deliberacy.
Nice.
You're like
Absolutely.
You're a sexual being, and that's great, and it's good to see yourself like that.
And find times where it's okay to talk about that. Make times where it's okay to talk about that.
Not even look for them, make them.
Yeah. If that's what you want, right?
Yeah, if you need that.
If that's what you feel like if you feel like that's going to be helpful, or if you feel like there is someone with whom you can do that.
Yeah.
There's no blanket takeaway from this. The blanket, like the thing for me is that, I'm sorry. I'm comfortable with non-closure.
Oh, I can't do it.
I'm really comfortable with it.
I need a movie with a.
I could get up and walk away right now.
No.
Oh.
Luke's garbage at understanding art.
I can understand it. Doesn't mean I like it.
Luke's got bad taste.
I think that for me, like some of the takeaway that I would like, and it's your show.
Yes.
How dare you introduce a takeaway?
I'm sorry. I'm so presumptuous. I think that a useful thing, at least for me, to take away from this conversation is that the conversations should happen in ways that feel like they work for you. And for some people, it's going to look like this. Open and all over the place and very positive. And for other people, it might just be moving a little bit. Having one little thought or offering an observation about something that they saw in the media to someone that they care about. Maybe that's pushing it just enough for them that they feel like they're a little more comfortable in it. I don't think that this is the goal for everybody.
No.
Yeah.
But I think
agree.
people should analyze any fears that they have around it, figure out where it's coming from, and if it's a useful fear to.
If I can put in a little plug, there's a tool. It's just a conceptual sort of self-examination tool that I encountered when I was in school. It was initially designed for discussing difficult conversations around race and how race impacts society and more specifically you and your communities. And the courageous conversations model or reflection exercise gets you to think about your moral thoughts on a subject and your social thoughts on it. Like, what's it like when you think about it with different groups of people, your parents, or conversations about it with peers, or conversations about it in academic environments. And there are some others as well on there. And what's so cool about it is it helps you to parse out what is so often pretty muddled about anything that feels dangerous or icky or controversial. It helps you to parse out different areas where you can see that, wow, I actually do have a lot of thoughts about this subject, and the thoughts that I have can be articulated if I try to break them down. And just coming to a better understanding of sexuality as an individual, even if you don't have someone in your life with whom you can have these kinds of conversations, or you don't feel like you have someone with whom you can have these conversations, you can have a tool where you can start to get a better sense of it for yourself. It's been useful for me. I taught a course on this at the undergraduate level this year, and it seemed really useful in that environment as well, and maybe it could be useful in this context too.
That's great.
Well, thank you so much.
Yep.
Yeah,
Awesome. Is there anything else? Yeah, I feel like we're winding down here, so
Close out. Close out.
So we're gonna close out.
Yeah, this has been
PCast here.
This has been an awesome conversation. I feel like we maybe haven't come to a takeaway per se.
I got enough of a takeaway.
If you got a takeaway, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
got a
But
takeaway. Good.
definitely, I have a lot to process from this, a lot to think about, a lot that I haven't thought about before that you've brought up. So thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for bringing your study, your expertise, and your personality to our podcast today. It's been so much fun to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I've delighted in this. You guys are great. I really appreciate what you're doing in terms of making spiritual conversations very human. I felt like this was a very human time. So
All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening or watching the Spiritable podcast. Feel free to subscribe or download a podcast anywhere you find them. iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, wherever, Stitcher, whatever. I don't even know what's all up there anymore.
Yeah, and
Check us out.
if you had any comments or questions, feel free to comment in our YouTube link below, or send us an email.
Comment in the YouTube
Hey,
link
you
below.
shut your mouth. Comment under our YouTube video in the comment section. You know the YouTubes.
Email us at spiritablepodcast@gmail.com. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.